Alright guys, so I thought I'd bring you along. Well, I've got my camera. I'm just going out to find some stuff to photograph. Now, one of my favourite things to take photos with is my macro lens. I think macro photography, if you get into it, is just brilliant. You can get such unusual photos, and it opens up a whole new world that you probably didn't even realise existed before. I can't tell you how much more observant I am since getting a macro lens. You just start looking at everything and seeing everything. And where before all I saw was maybe a bit of grass, I'm noticing little wildflowers, insects. And it makes the world a much more interesting place when you're into macro photography. Now, I started off with a Panasonic bridge camera that could take macro shots, and I absolutely loved it. So when I got my first DSLR, one of the primary lenses I wanted was a macro lens. And macro lenses, like all lenses, are pretty expensive. So I went down the route of using a manual focus lens. And a lot of photographers will tell you that macro photography has to be taken on a tripod. And to an extent I agree. You know, if you want a focus stack, you've got to have a tripod. If you want to get your photo sharp, yeah, you want a tripod. But that really is dependent on the camera you use. I had a Nikon D7200 as my first camera, and I think we all know the rule of thumb of a shutter speed 2 times the focal length is the golden rule for getting photos acceptably sharp. But it really didn't work for me with the D7200. You know, using that rule, I came nowhere near close. You know, if I had a 200mm lens on, I would be looking at like 500th of a second to get the photo sharp. So pretty much everything that I took photos of with that camera was with a tripod. Now, I got the itch for a full frame camera, like I think a lot of us do, and I got the D700. I was amazed at the difference. Now, because it's a bigger sensor with lower resolution, the photo sites on the sensor are much bigger, which means much better dynamic range, but also it's much more forgiving when hand holding. And all of a sudden I could hand hold and get acceptably sharp photos very easily, whereas before with the D7200 it was nigh on impossible. And I'm not even talking landscape shots, portrait shots, I'm talking macro shots. Even my macro lens with an extension tube or a teleconverter to get beyond life size, I could still get them sharp handheld. And that's why I upgraded to the D3S, because this beast is so good in low light. It means you can bump the ISO up, keep a fast shutter speed, and still you know, get a sharp photo, which means I don't have to carry my tripod around with me. I can get a photo of whatever I want without having a tripod on my back. Now if I got the money for a carbon fibre tripod, that would be alright, but I haven't. And secondly, in spending a couple of years really getting into macro photography, a tripod is really an absolute pain in the arse. Now, by the time you've worked out what composition you want, you've set up the tripod, you've got it in focus, you've got your settings right, the light may have changed, or maybe the wind's blowing and you know you just haven't got the time to get it right. That's where hand holding is such a joy. You know, you can find what you want, you can quickly get located, and you can quickly get your shot and then move on. It's so much less faff. Like I said, the great thing about macro photography as opposed to landscape photography, you're not governed by the weather. You don't have to worry about if there's some nice clouds in the sky. Is it raining? Is it cloudy? You know, pretty much all weather is good for macro photography, and it means that you can just go out in your garden, you can go for a little walk and you'll find something. So here I've got a lot of vetch, I've got a massive bumblebee on the thistles. You know, I've just walked out of my house and I've got all this. So I'm going to see where I can get a decent shot. I've decided to move on. Now I would really recommend to new photographers to learn the basics. Use Aperture Priority so you can see how it affects the shutter speed and the ISO and you know the effects of depth of field. Use Shutter Priority, see how that changes the outcome, and when you're ready, use manual exposure and take control of everything. And when I got to manual exposure, I kind of developed this sort of air of superiority that I was really good because I could shoot in manual exposure. But after a while I suddenly realised I was limiting myself. You know, when you're shooting insects, you haven't got time to faff around with every setting, and you know, there is nothing wrong with using priority mode or aperture mode as long as you can understand the effects. So it's like if I'm shooting insects, I'll just keep an eye on the shutter speed and adjust the aperture to what I want. You know, the benefit there is speed. You know, I can go in and get a photograph. If I'm faffing around, you know, chances are the insect's flown away. Especially with bumblebees, because they are so quick. They don't hang around. So the way I set up my camera when I'm doing macro shots is Aperture Priority. With that, I've got an eye on what the shutter speed is. Now if I can reduce the aperture down to, you know, f16 and the shutter speed is too low, I can just bump up the ISO, and thanks to the D3S I can take shots with, you know, ISO in the range of 5 to 10,000 and still get a good shot. So that's really a big perk And the great thing about the macro lens is, you know, you can still use it as a medium telephoto lens. So here I've got some harebells, fungi, yarrow, all growing on this cliff's edge. Just going to watch my footing and let's see what I can get. So I mean, there's some real cool fungi here. So I might try a focus stack, getting the first mushroom in focus and then the middle, because I can't get that all in focus. Another thing I like about macro photography is after it's raining, you've got the raindrops on flowers. It's something you cannot underestimate the importance of, is composition. You know, it's like you learn a new trick and then you tend to become dependent on it, which is just no good. Like with flower photography, close-ups, the rule of thirds is really something that doesn't apply. Now I'll show you. You take a photograph of a flower, and you put it in the centre, you know, it looks like it's supposed to be there. If you put it off centre on like the third, it just looks misplaced. It looks like, you know, the viewer will be like, well, why have you put it there? The rule of thirds, it's not a rule, it's a guide. And it's not one that you should follow every time. So I've got a hoverfly and some lady's bedstraw here. Oh, it's gone. Bit of a sheer drop. Don't fancy going down there. Some birdfoot trefoil. Carefully does it. It's a long way down. Right. I think I'll head back. So some little tips to improve your macro photography. If you're using a tripod, look at it from all the angles before you put your tripod down. Don't come across a nice flower, set up your tripod and take a photo, but actually look at it. Well, I learnt this from John Shaw's book on close-ups and macro photography, and his nature photography book. Beginners are all too eager to see something they like, set the camera down, put it on the tripod and take a photograph with little to no consideration for lighting or composition. A nice subject does not make a good photograph. If you're shooting handheld like I do, back button focusing, you know, that's an absolute treat. You know, it's so much easier to use. I think when I first discovered it, I found it really awkward and clunky, and I stopped doing it. But after it got recommended so many times, I decided to give it another go. And yeah, it really is a bit of a game changer, to be honest. You know, you focus with your thumb, use my forefinger to dial in the exposure, you know, adjusting the aperture. I use my left thumb to click the ISO button at the bottom of the back screen, and I can adjust that with my right forefinger. So with my eye to the viewfinder, I can adjust the aperture and the ISO. So I'm going to show you a simple photo stack in Photoshop. Here I took two photos of a harebell, one with the stamen in focus, one focusing just behind it. So you go into File, Automate, Photo Merge, and just make sure that it's got blend images together. Pick your two photos, or three or four, and load it up. Now Photoshop will do its best to create a photo stack. As you can see here, it hasn't worked. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's a bit hit or miss. If you press Shift and click on the mask, you can hide the mask and see the photograph underneath. So as that was a fail, I'll go into File, Scripts, Load Files into a stack. Select the photos again and make sure it automatically aligns source images. And that way it will just stack the two photographs on top of each other as best as possible. Now these were taken handheld, so not a complete match, but close enough. And if you just hide one photograph, you can see how close a match Photoshop's done it. So what I'll do now is put a mask on top image and change the colours of the paintbrush to black, and that will reveal the image underneath. Make sure you have paintbrush selected. And there you go, just paint in the areas that you want to reveal. Now you can just check alternating between the two images to see where any bits you've missed. if you reveal the wrong bit, you know, just change the colour from black to white and hide it. It's good to have some of the shortcuts memorised, like X will change from white to black. So there we go. I'm just going to blur these back buds because I want the focus to be on the harebell itself. Now I'll crop out the translucent bits, although you can fill them with Photoshop relatively simply. Now this is where I do like to use the rule of thirds. This is the golden ratio rule of thirds, so it's not quite a third, but the focal point for me is the stamen, so I'm getting that in the centre on the third. There's a little bit of translucent background in the corner, so I'll just clone that out. Now right here there's maybe a bit of pollen was on the lens, so I'll just zoom in, take the source from as close as possible so it's a good colour match. So now I'm happy I've got the two images blended together. I'll just do Command Alt Shift and E to create a new layer from visible. Then I'm going to duplicate the layer, Command J, and this is my sharpening process. So that top layer I've turned vivid. I'll do Command I to invert it. Then I'll go to Gaussian blur and I'll adjust the blur. And if you go too far you get this haloing effect which will be very over sharpened. So I'll reduce it down to 2 to 3 pixels, whatever looks right. And then Command highlight the bottom layer, Command G to put them into a group. Turn that group into overlay and the sharpening effect will be applied. I'll then create a black mask with Alt Mask Select, which will hide all of the sharpening effect, and then I'll paint through the areas that I want to be sharpened. Any areas that have, sharpening will, you don't want any sharpening done to the blurred background. You know, that can just create a sort of grainy effect. So now I'll flatten the image and I'll take it into lab mode or lab color through image, and in here I'll do the apply saturation effects. I do this by opening a curves adjustment. So you go into channel A, input, I'll put that around 90. Do the same for the other side. Go into channel B, repeat the process, and this is just simply saturating all the channels. And then I'll just adjust the opacity of that curve adjustment. So it's helpful to take it from minimum to maximum just to see, you know, the effect. It's always going to be way too saturated at the 100% mark, so I take it down to the minimum and slowly increase it until I think it's about right. Now if you want to adjust a particular colour, you know, just go to hue saturation, click on the colour you want to adjust and have a play with the sliders. Now the greens look a bit too vibrant, so I'm going to select the greens and just reduce the saturation a touch. I'll make the harebell pop out. And that's it. And as a bonus, here's just a shot of the neighbour's horse. He's got all this fencing and the farm in the background. It's just so easy to clone out using Photoshop. Really, one tool you would you got to get familiar with, because it can really mean that a photo that was unusable you can actually turn into one you'd like to keep.